When the public is flooded with nonstop headlines, urgent notifications, breaking news banners, and emotionally charged commentary, it is easy to assume that society is witnessing transparency in action. In reality, what is often happening is not the free flow of information, but the careful management of attention. Modern power systems do not depend primarily on secrecy, they depend on saturation. By overwhelming citizens with dramatic language terms like crisis, unprecedented threat to democracy, and national emergency, the narrative is steered toward emotional reactions and personal judgments rather than structural understanding. The focus shifts to individual characters, courtroom drama, and partisan outrage, while the deeper forces shaping the outcome remain largely invisible. People argue over legality, intent, and morality, rarely pausing to ask why the system reacted when it did and not earlier, or why certain actions suddenly became intolerable. In advanced capitalist societies, political authority is tolerated as long as it operates within unwritten but rigid boundaries defined by economic stability. These boundaries are not codified in constitutions or statutes. They're enforced through market behavior, investor confidence, and institutional norms. A leader may be divisive, incompetent, or even deeply unpopular and still remain in power so long as their actions do not threaten the economic framework that underpins the state. However, when leadership behavior introduces unpredictability, especially volatility that affects energy markets, debt servicing, currency confidence, or global trade relationships, the tolerance collapses rapidly. At that point, mechanisms that once appeared dormant or symbolic suddenly activate. Legal tools are elevated, constitutional clauses are rediscovered, and extraordinary actions are reframed as moral necessities. The intervention is presented as a defense of democratic values, but beneath that rhetoric lies a more fundamental objective, the preservation of order. The spectacle absorbs public attention, creating the illusion of participatory debate, while the machinery of power works quietly and efficiently to restore equilibrium and reaffirm the hierarchy in which economic stability outweighs political loyalty or public sentiment. To understand why these reactions occur with such urgency, one must confront how fragile the global economic system truly is. Despite its immense scale and technological sophistication, it rests on a narrow foundation of confidence, leverage, and uninterrupted flows of energy and capital. Among these, oil occupies a uniquely critical position. It is not merely another traded commodity, but the backbone of modern industrial civilization. Transportation networks, food production, manufacturing, supply chains, military operations, and even digital infrastructure depend on stable and predictable access to energy. Any credible disruption, whether caused by conflict, sanctions, erratic policymaking, or geopolitical brinkmanship, immediately reverberates through global markets. Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes are recalculated, futures markets spike, and inflationary pressure accelerates long before any physical shortage occurs. Inflation does not wait for official confirmation. It moves on anticipation and fear. Rising inflation forces central banks to tighten monetary policy, increasing interest rates that ripple through mortgages, consumer credit, government borrowing, and corporate debt. At this point, a political crisis transforms into a systemic financial threat. Bond markets respond without ideology or loyalty, punishing instability with higher yields and reduced confidence. Treasury departments, central bankers, institutional investors, and multinational lenders monitor these signals constantly, fully aware that a prolonged loss of confidence can cripple an economy for a generation. Many senior political officials are deeply embedded in this financial ecosystem, often through prior careers or future prospects tied to corporate boards and advisory roles. Their incentives are structurally aligned with continuity and predictability rather than with any single leader. When forced to choose between personal loyalty and systemic survival, the structure itself dictates the outcome. This process does not require secret meetings or conspiracies. It is the predictable result of incentives interacting under stress. What makes these moments especially revealing is the speed and coherence with which diverse institutions align once economic risk becomes undeniable. The military establishment, often portrayed as purely hierarchical and obedient, is in fact deeply conservative in the literal sense of the word. It prioritizes predictability, long-term planning, alliance stability, and logistical coherence. Sudden, impulsive escalation disrupts procurement schedules, intelligence coordination, and strategic doctrine developed over decades. Similarly, the administrative state, frequently dismissed as slow or obstructive, demonstrates remarkable coordination when its own survival and legitimacy are at stake. Bureaucratic friction becomes a tool, procedures slow momentum, legal reviews multiply, and ambiguity is used to delay dangerous action. Donor networks, corporate stakeholders, and financial backers send their own signals through quieter channels by freezing contributions, withdrawing public support, or repositioning themselves strategically. None of this requires dramatic confrontation or public declarations. Power in modern systems rarely announces itself. It synchronizes. By the time the public witnesses a decisive intervention, the consensus is already formed across institutions that rarely agree on anything else. The intervention is then narrated as responsible, stabilizing, and unavoidable. Market rebounds are cited as evidence of correctness, as if financial relief itself were moral validation. Stability becomes proof, and proof becomes justification. Yet this framing conceals a critical truth. The stabilization being celebrated overwhelmingly protects those whose wealth, influence, and institutional power are most exposed to systemic collapse. The language of national interest and democratic preservation functions as a mask for a far narrower set of priorities centered on capital preservation and institutional continuity. The most unsettling reality is not that these interventions occur, but that their costs are almost never borne by those who authorize them. The public is encouraged to feel relief, reassurance, and even gratitude, as though stability were a gift rather than a trade-off. The consequences are deferred, diluted, and distributed downward over time. Higher living costs, reduced public investment, wage stagnation, and constrained economic mobility emerge gradually, framed as unfortunate but unavoidable outcomes of abstract forces rather than deliberate choices. Those who acted in the name of stability frequently exit public office into protected and lucrative positions, consulting firms, corporate boards, think tanks, and advisory roles buffered from the long-term social consequences of their decisions. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens are left with the appearance of participation rather than genuine influence. Elections may rotate individuals in and out of office, but they rarely challenge the structural limits within which those individuals operate. These moments expose a central tension in modern democracy. Political choice exists, but only within boundaries defined by capital and systemic risk tolerance. When those boundaries are crossed, corrective action follows regardless of public opinion or electoral mandate. Recognizing this does not require nihilism or despair, only clarity. Power does not behave chaotically when it intervenes. It behaves rationally according to incentives, risk calculations, and self-preservation. When the headlines fade and public attention shifts elsewhere, the system remains intact, having once again demonstrated that economic order is not simply a priority among many, but the final authority that all other values ultimately serve.